Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Praissman with Interactive Brokers Podcast, and it's my pleasure to welcome back to our show Nasdaq's U.S. economist, Michael Normyle. Hey, Michael, how are you?
Hi, doing well, thanks.
It's always great to have you for our once-a-month podcast on the economy. And today we're going to talk about IPO activity. So I wanted to kick it off. It's been an unusual year, right? With the election and having an incumbent president drop out mid-race and then a new candidate come in. Just in general, how has the IPO activity been so far this year in the U.S.?
This year and the last couple of years, really, we've seen IPO activity trending up, but pretty modestly after bottoming in late 2022. So through mid-November, we've seen just over 200 IPOs in the US. By this time last year, we had seen 145. But if you go back to 2021, which was really the kind of peak that we saw in the last several years here and really few decades, we'd had over 900 IPOs by this time that year.
So it sounds like this year was a little bit bigger than last year, but certainly smaller than the year before. But just as far as this year is concerned, as we approach the elections, did the IPOs, like the number of IPOs increase? Did they slow down or stay the same throughout the entire year? Just curious of the pattern of it.
Yeah, we've definitely seen a pickup in IPOs. So October this year, we saw 37 IPOs, which is the most in a month since December of 2021. But since the election was so recent, it's hard to say if that's an increase in IPO activity because of anything to do with the election or if it's just that IPO activity has been trending up. But historically, there is a pattern in election years that are a little bit different than non-election years. Historically, elections don't impact the amount of IPOs in a year, but they do impact the timing. So in those election years, there's usually a pull forward of IPO activity into August, September, and October, which tend to see about 30% more IPOs in election years than in non-election years. And then that's offset by a quieter November, of course, when we had the election. But by December, the number of IPOs, it's again indistinguishable between election years and non-election years.
Got it. Got it. And what sectors are seeing the largest number of IPOs this year?
Yeah, so we've seen the most coming from healthcare. They've had 40 so far through mid-November. And then industrials with, I think, 34, definitely more than 30. And then the third most is consumer discretionary with 26. And it's not a sector, but we've seen 48 SPACs as well this year.
So that's actually just those three sectors is a pretty significant portion of that 200 overall. Definitely heavily weighted toward those three sectors versus any other ones. Conversely, what sectors have seen the least number of those?
Yeah, the least is definitely utilities with 0. But after that, materials, they have 2, and they didn't see their first IPO this year until the end of July. And then real estate and energy each have had 4 so far.
And I want to kind of turn our attention to, something we haven't had in quite a while, which was a rate cut. And historically, do interest rate cuts, how do they influence IPO activity, or do they not at all?
No, yeah, interest rates are definitely a factor. One reason the IPO environment has been slower compared to 2020 and 2021 is the Fed's rate hike cycle that began in early 2022 and then ended in September of this year when they did their first rate cut. And there's a couple reasons why higher rates are a drag on IPOs. So first, they're bad for valuations. Higher rates increase borrowing costs, and then that makes it more expensive to generate future earnings. And again, at the margin, worse valuations result in fewer IPOs. And then second, and more immediately, higher borrowing costs also hurt margins. And this is especially true for smaller companies, since data shows that about 40% of small cap debt is floating rate compared to just 7% for large caps. And so as a result, the Fed's rate hike cycle doubled the ratio of interest expense to earnings for US small caps from about 20% to over 45%. And that's the highest this ratio has been this century, aside from a couple recession-related spikes around 2001 and COVID. But that's really due to falling earnings instead of rising interest expense. And so despite many other factors being supportive of IPOs in the last year or two, this increased interest expense was a 1-2 punch for companies considering an IPO, first by worsening valuations and then by weighing on margins, hurting their financial picture. So as rates fall, this should make it easier for companies to grow profits and improving microcap valuations.
So essentially, potentially seeing a number greater than 200 or 140 the last 2 years, maybe not quite up to 900 right away, but certainly perfectly maybe trending that way.
We can dream at Nasdaq, we'll see.
That's true. That's true. What are some ways that people can track IPO activity in the US?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Of course, we have the Nasdaq IPO Pulse, and that's a leading indicator of U.S. IPO activity. And it's something we introduced at the start of this year. So it combines six individual leading indicators of IPO activity, including interest rates, into one number, one index. It's designed to anticipate directional shifts in IPO activity, meaning when the trend in activity is likely to change from an uptrend to a downtrend and vice versa. And historically, it leads those turning points by about half a year. So it's supposed to help people get a sense of if the IPO market is going to be improving, becoming a better time to IPO, or if there's some cyclical headwinds moving against it. And if you're interested in IPO activity elsewhere, we also have the NASDAQ Stockholm IPO Pulse, which of course leads the directional shifts in IPO activity in Sweden. So if you're interested, you want to keep up on what these indicators show, we do publish quarterly updates in the Market Makers blog on NASDAQ.
Great. Yeah, you actually beat me to my next question, which was activity outside the US, because obviously a lot of our listeners and clients not only trade in the US, but we also pull in a worldwide audience and offer access to those Nordic markets as well. Pivoting again, what about the VIX? Is there a relationship between like volatility and IPO activity? I don't want to say my assumption out loud. I'd rather the experts say it, but I'm assuming there is.
Yeah, definitely. Volatility is another factor that we use in the IPO pulse. And naturally, companies prefer to IPO when volatility is coming down instead of moving up. And we were talking about elections earlier. So, typical of close election years, which we discussed in our last podcast together, volatility tends to increase in the months leading up to presidential elections, given the uncertainty around the potential outcome. But once that uncertainty is resolved, volatility drops. And so that's exactly what we've seen post-election this time around. So another factor that could be, moving in a positive direction for IPO activity.
Yeah. And you basically, one last question, and you just covered it briefly a couple questions ago. As far as IPO activity trending for 2025, but also I'd like to maybe add to it with the change of parties, do you think there may be not just whether activity is going to increase, which it sounds like at least it's estimated that it will. Well, what about potentially these sectors? Would they change, do you think, or stay the same, or it's really hard to tell right now so early in the process?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say right now just because there is a lot of uncertainty about what the ultimate policies will be. But IPO activity in general, there's a lot of cyclical tailwinds currently. The market is setting new highs, volatility and Fed rates are coming down. And through September, the IPO pulse, it's near its recent 3-year high. So that means we should be able to expect IPO activity to continue this uptrend that we've seen into early next year. We'll see with our next update in January if this trend continues. But for now, things are looking good for activity staying in an upturn, at least into the early part of next year.
Michael, as always, this was great. I want to remind our listeners that they can find all of our old podcasts, our previous aired podcasts on our website, on YouTube, on Spotify, Amazon Music, those kind of distributions that people can listen to. Upcoming past podcasts from Michael and Nasdaq, from all our other contributors. And also, they don't need to read through a ton of research reports. They can just look at this IPO pulse and get a look of where things are going as well, which is a really nice trading tool for them to use. So again, thank you so much for stopping by. Always looking forward to it and looking forward to our next one next month.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you.
The analysis in this material is provided for information only and is not and should not be construed as an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to buy any security. To the extent that this material discusses general market activity, industry, or sector trends, or other broad-based economic or political conditions, it should not be construed as research or investment advice. To the extent that it includes references to specific securities, commodities, currencies, or other instruments, those references do not constitute a recommendation by IBKR to buy, sell, or hold such investments. This material does not and is not intended to take into account the particular financial conditions, investment objectives, or requirements of individual customers. Before acting on this material, you should consider whether it is suitable for your particular circumstances and, as necessary, seek professional advice.